we praise you and pray, Lord, that you would speak to us through your word today. And Lord, that you would challenge us and encourage us as well. We thank you and praise in the name of Jesus. Amen. So, yeah, we've started a new series. We just started last week. We're going into the book of Romans, and this year we're proclaiming to be transformers, right? More than meets the eye, as they would say. But you know, it's an understanding of how God has transformed us and how He is desiring us to be agents of change and transformation to those that are around us. So we're going to the book of Romans to understand that change that has already happened in us so far. Okay? So the question I want to ask you, just to kind of get you thinking, is what are some things that people have either taught you or you've kind of learned that you realize later on in life was not true? What are some of these things?
Santa Claus.
Huh? Santa Claus? Okay. I hope every one of you understands that Santa Claus is not going to come. Like, how do you tell that to someone who doesn't have a chimney? Like, it doesn't make sense. If you live in an apartment, like, is Santa going to like buzz in? How does that work? Okay. What else? Anything else that you were taught that you realized later really wasn't so true?
That if you go to a good college, your life is gonna be so good.
Oh, that one stings. That one stings. Our sister over there went to one of the top women's colleges in America, and didn't account for that much, huh? So yeah, where you go to school doesn't necessarily determine the course of your life. Some of us have learned that, and some of us are seeing that there's much more to life than a degree. Okay? Anything else?
When I was little, my mom told me that if I leave my food and don't finish everything, before I go to heaven, like, it's all gonna be piled up in one bowl.
And you have to eat it
I
all?
have to eat it all before I go into heaven. I still have
That's hilarious. Like, parents tell the funniest things to kids to get them to obey them, right? Like, so did you eat because of that?
Yeah. I believed that until I was like 13.
Oh my gosh, 13!
Yeah.
Wow, so Sarah, yeah, she finished her food. Okay. So like, the funny thing is, like, I think it happens a lot to little kids. And honestly, for those of you that are around kids often, some of you that teach or just like tutor and stuff like that, it's really easy to lie to kids, right? Like, honestly, like they don't doubt anything that you're saying. Like, really? Whoa, right? You can completely mess up their lives with those things that you say. It's amazing. A couple things that I remember when I was a kid. For some reason, my parents never told me about Santa Claus, but for some reason they wanted to tell me that the tooth fairy was real. I have no idea why, right? Any of you guys do that where the tooth comes out and you put it in an envelope and you put it under your pillow? Any of you guys did that as a kid? Quite a few of you. So I remember doing this. I think I was maybe like 2nd or 3rd grade, so I wasn't that young anymore. And I remember doing this, and I remember being very skeptical. I was like, come on, there's no tooth fairy. And then I wake up in the morning, and what shocked me was that the envelope that I had put the tooth in that I had sealed was still sealed, right? My parents must have like steamed it or something. Like they must have thought ahead, like because it was still a sealed envelope, unless they replaced envelope. Maybe they did that. I don't know. Regardless, as a kid, because you know, I was a thinking kid, so I was like, what? Is the tooth fairy real? Should I knock out all my teeth? Get a bunch of money? So I remember that as a kid. That was one of those things. But the thing that I kind of wanted to have you guys think in your head was, growing up as a kid, especially watching as much TV as I did as a kid, was that a constant theme that came out in almost every program that I saw was this concept that everyone is good inside. It's a constant theme in all the shows and programs that everyone is good inside. And so that's what I thought. And you know, when you think that everyone is good inside, then that kind of shifts how you think about different things. And I realized later that really wasn't that true. And we'll kind of get into that in the Word today. So Romans 1, verses 18 to 32. Turn with me in your Word, or smartphones, or look at the screen above. Romans 1, verses 18 to 32. Where the Lord says this: "The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal being, or a mortal human being, and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural, sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them." Does sound like America, right?
Yeah.
So honestly, as we were going through this list of evil things that bring out the wrath of God, it's what we see. Whether it's America, whether it's Korea, it's what we see on a day-to-day thing. And if we're being honest, some of these things we struggle with, right? Some of these things, it's things that we do from time to time. So, going back very quickly, last week in the very first part of chapter 1, Paul writes to the Roman church saying that he wants to tell them about the gospel of God, right? Not other good news. Remember, the gospel means good news. And he clearly makes a distinction between this is the gospel of God. This is not just any random good news that I'm telling you. This is the good news. This is the only good news that you need to know. And he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God to bring salvation. Right? That's the gospel. And he goes from that point right into this, where it's becoming very clear that there is a wrath of God which comes from the sin of man. And the reason why is because, you really look at this, if you know your Old Testament, you look at the story of Noah, you see there's a flood and all this, you go back to it, and if you really look at what happened during the time of Noah, 1,500 years had passed since Adam and Eve. 1,500 years. And this is 1,500 years where sin just went rampant. Everyone was sinning. They were doing whatever they wanted. So much so that God looked at creation. He looked at what he had created. He looked at what used to be perfect and good and said, I need to start over again. What is this mess? And so he creates this flood and he wipes out everything except for Noah and his family and these animals. And then he allows them to live and to restart, and he says, I will never do this again. We'll get back to that symbol later on, right? But he promises, I will never do this again. But that story shows that sin can corrupt so much, can corrupt creation itself so much that God desires to just completely destroy it. That is what sin can do. And that is how much God hates sin. I think from time to time we forget about that. From time to time we're like, you know, I'm not so bad. You know, I do some things every now and then. But when you really think about it, it is the sins of us and everyone that's been before us that are just piling up and are just driving God in his wrath, because he is perfect, he is good, and he can't accept this. And what he makes very clear when you look at chapter 1 is creation testifies to the existence of God. His invisible qualities are made clear by his own creation, by what he has made. Now, I was talking about this last week. You put anybody, you take them out of the city, you put them in nature long enough, you take away their cell phones, you take away all these distractions, and I really truly believe in my heart of hearts that any person will eventually come to the conclusion there has to be a creator. Someone had to have made this. Because the alternative to that is everything was randomly made, right? Just kind of happened. There was like, this lightning kind of zapped, and this little single cell organism magically formed and started to split off, and all these little like amoebas were just bouncing around, and they turned into like a tadpole, and then to a fish, and then the fish became like a reptile. It's all these things that really, when you think about it, really, like, is that really how life came to be? Now, I come from kind of a weird transition period in education. When I was a younger kid, I was going to a Christian private school, so I was taught creationism, right? But I remember when I was in elementary school, there were still arguments going on in public school whether they should teach creation, like creationism, or evolution. For most of you, like, you guys are way past that point. For most of you, you were taught evolution as truth. For me, I was in the period, I remember my 7th grade teacher, she was teaching us from this book, and then she was all like, yeah, this book's actually illegal, I'm not supposed to be teaching from this. And I was like, what? And it was a book on evolution. Like, this was a transition that was going on when I was younger. By the time I was in high school, evolution was truth. But when I was in middle school and elementary school, they weren't really sure what to teach, right? And so I kind of got both sides. And so now we're living in a period in time where people are taught that evolution is truth. This is how things came to be. This is a very recent phenomenon, right? And so I remember I actually preached from part of this passage before at Yonsei University, right? So the one time they allowed me to go and speak at the chapel there, I spoke on this. You guys are laughing because you know what happened. I spoke on this and I challenged them. I was like, you guys are brilliant, like college students. This is the one time you can actually ask questions. Your whole life you've been taught that this is truth. And what I want to tell you today is it requires as much faith, if not more, than believing in the God of the Bible, that he created the world, than to believe in evolution. Evolution requires so much faith. And that's not told to you. You're basically being taught it as if it's true and it's real. And I was like, you know what? This is the one time in your life where you can ask the right questions. After the service, there are 2 people that came up to me. The first was an angry Catholic, because the Pope has actually affirmed theistic evolution. So meaning that evolution is true, but it was God ordained, right? And so he was angry at me. He's like, blah, blah, blah. Pope said this. I was like, okay. I was like, I understand that's a view. I just didn't feel like presenting that view. And he's like, whatever. But then the other person that came up to me, this is why they're laughing. So there's a department there called Techno Art. There's a brand new department. Those of you who are Yonsei, you guys know what Techno Art is. This is right when it started. And I was like, for those of you guys that are here, when you hear the word Techno Art, you're probably like, what is that? Right? Like, what is Techno Art? And so I was warming up the crowd. I was telling jokes. I was being funny and whatnot. This was at the end of a bunch of jokes, so they should have known I was trying to be funny. And so what I said was, what's Techno Art? I was like, technical, I think on one side, nerdy engineer like me, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, art. This is where I got in trouble. Art. I was thinking, you know, maybe kind of depressed, maybe a little bit suicidal. That's the word I shouldn't have used. I didn't realize how sensitive Koreans are to that. But in America, it's kind of just that funny stereotype that artists are kind of suicidal, right? So then I said, put it together, and you got this nerdy, suicidal, or depressed nerd, right? Something like that. Everyone's laughing. Ah. The second person that came up to me was representing that entire department. And she was like, and I was like, I'm sorry. And she's like speaking to me in Korean, and she's like, I want you to learn what techno art means. Honestly, I still don't know. I tried. I really did. I actually had to email the whole department and apologize. And ever since then, I've never been invited back to speak at Yonsei. Because I shamed the entire department. But regardless, I bring this, I brought, you know, the reason why I wanted to raise this question to these Yonsei students, these freshmen, was, again, this is the one time you can challenge what you've been taught to be real. Now the reason why I say these things, evolution has a lot of holes that people don't talk about. There's no intermediate species, right? There's no such thing as something that's jumping from one species to another, right? I think it's very well proven that there is such thing as microevolution. Adaptation, very clear. But macroevolution, jumping stages, there's still no proof of that, right? Or even when you get to things like the Big Bang Theory. Big Bang Theory. It's like this matter just starts compressing and compressing, and then boom! I don't know who came up with that. It's kind of stupid. But the problem with that simple idea is, where did that matter come from? Hello? You're not telling the origin of everything if there was magically already stuff there. Like, hello? And so, that's the thing, is these things that people are being taught, it's distracting us from the reality. Now, what the passage is really saying is that because creation testifies to the very existence of God, no one has an excuse. This is a very big statement. This is basically saying, you know, it doesn't matter where you're born in the world, doesn't matter what time period you're born in, just the fact that you lived on this earth, you are condemned because you are able to witness that this wonderful creation must have a creator. And when you make that realization, you are then obligated to connect with that creator. But what we see in the passage is that human nature, we choose something else. Human nature pushes us in another direction. Now, the passage goes on and says how they claim to be wise even though they were fools. Now, for me, I've talked about this before, but the more intellectual, the more quote-unquote bright that you are, at least in Western society, the less likely you're going to be a Christian. Because the sentiment, at least in America, and I think it's true in Korea as well, in some sense, is that Christianity is for the dumb. If you're a smart person, you should know better. And I've had arguments with a lot of my friends. Like one of my friends, he went to the University of Chicago, he's a doctor, very bright guy, and he's always like, what are you doing, man? Why are you a pastor? It's like, so many things you could do, right? What are you doing? And he's just constantly just looking down on me and just kind of berating me. And I've gotten into arguments with him for years over these different issues, and he's told me his stance that like religion was basically manufactured by man. It was part of the evolution process, right? As man evolved, that they needed a way to govern themselves and a way to control their behavior, right? So he's like, you know, morality exists just to keep us from killing each other. It's part of evolution. That's one of his thoughts. Sounds really cool, right? And he's like, you know, it's good for people to be Christian because then they're not killing each other. But that's for the dumb people, basically, is what he's saying. Now for others that aren't as educated to him, and I talk to them and like, you know, they just don't want to believe, or they would rather just enjoy their lives and do whatever the heck they want, I can respect that because at least they're being honest with me. But for him, his stance on like, you know, oh, you know, the intellectually bright shouldn't be believers. It's like, and it's part of the evolutionary process. It's basically like he's putting himself in another class. He's like, silly Christians. And it's just like, what? Like, you really think you're that wise? And honestly, it's a very hard person to hang out with these days. I don't think he has many friends. But that's basically what happens is when you end up on this intellectual side and you're basically making these theories on how none of this is real, religion is not real, God is not real, we are just part of the evolutionary process. What's the hope in that? Like, seriously, what is the end goal? If I'm just part of humanity's evolutionary process, then what is the point of my life? By evolutionary standards, it's to procreate. I'm very far behind on that. But basically, the point of my existence is to make as many babies as possible to continue to uphold the human race, right? What kind of joy is there in that? Like, that's all there is. Just make babies and continue the evolutionary process, whatever that means. Because to me, it's like, I would rather be wrong and have hope than to have nothing to live for. So, this is what has happened. In the passage, it talks about how God has made himself clearly known, but man is settling instead for these images of human beings and animals and reptiles and whatnot. Basically, man is choosing something inferior. And this is still true today. We're not necessarily worshiping statues anymore. We've kind of moved beyond that, but we're still worshiping something else. Brothers and sisters, the very nature of man is to worship something. If it's not God, it's something else. Right? And what is happening is man is choosing a counterfeit, something that is inferior to God, and instead indulging themselves in their normal nature of desiring sin, desiring to do sinful things. That's the state that we live in today. Choose something else and just live the life that you desire to live. That's basically the society that we live in today. And so it jumps in. It's very interesting that right from that point on, the passage talks a lot about sexual immorality. It starts talking about like women and women, men and men, all these different things. Immediately, that's the first thing it talks about. No other sin. It gets into the list of other sins later. The first thing it talks about is sexual immorality. And it's rather interesting to me. Now, I've made the point before that I don't believe in gradations of sin, meaning that I don't believe that any one sin is necessarily worse than the other. Because when you get to that point, then you start rationalizing, well, this sin's not that bad, so I can get away with this. It's not like I'm killing anybody, right? So it's like, you shouldn't look at degrees of sin, but for whatever reason, Scripture takes a lot of emphasis on sexual sins. And even in this passage, it's the first thing that pops up. Now, I talked about that symbol from Noah, the irony of the rainbow, right? What did the rainbow originally represent?
The covenant.
God's promise that he would never destroy the world again. It's a sign of mercy, it's a sign of grace. What does the rainbow mean today? Everyone says gay. So now the sign of the rainbow is one of embracing, gays and lesbians and transgenders, right? And, I was saddened the other, back when everyone had Facebook profiles that were in the rainbow colors, because I was like, especially because a lot of these were like Christian friends. I was like, do you know what you're doing? And then it's funny because Korea hasn't really caught on that much, because this other church that I was at in Incheon, they were like, oh, it's raining, here, take an umbrella, and it was just like rainbow and umbrella, and I was like, what? And they're like, yeah, it's our church umbrella. I was like, what? I was like, isn't it pretty? No. I was like, I'm just gonna walk in the rain. So it hasn't really caught on here in Korea, but there's an irony here. That something that represents God's mercy from judgment and his wrath is now a symbol of acceptance of something that is clearly sin in his eyes. And so I know, the Supreme Court has said that same-sex marriages are legal and whatnot. And honestly, I don't feel it's the position of the church to challenge that. We can, but I don't think it's necessarily our job to. Our job is to believe in the truth of the Word. And the Word tells us that that is not right. Doesn't mean it's our job to enforce that on society. And our job is not to go around and to do a witch hunt on like singling out people that are living that lifestyle. No. We are to love them as any brother and sister. And if any were to come into this room, we would show them the love of Christ. We wouldn't accept what they're doing, but we wouldn't exclude them. So I just want to make it very clear what I'm saying. Is that sin is sin. And even though society is becoming acceptant of that sin, that doesn't mean we should. That doesn't mean, like I've heard people tell me, shouldn't the Bible be updated? Right? If our society accepts this, we should update the Bible. No. The one thing that we have as our standard of truth is the Bible. The one thing. We should never change it. Because God is not changing. His truths are not changing. So the thing is, people, when they bring up that idea of updating things, they bring up this issue of same-sex marriage, of issues with gays and lesbians as something that has never happened before. But the reality of it is, this was an issue back then, right? Homosexuality has been an issue probably since almost the beginning of time. This is not a new thing. And people have brought up the argument with me, well, the DSM, it used to be considered a psychological abnormality, but then they changed it in the 70s. And they took it out of the DSM. And to me, I'm like, what is that telling me? That's telling me that society is bending. It's telling me people are bending. They had an understanding of truth before and they've changed their minds. Doesn't mean we should change the Bible. And so, this is the reality of what we live in today, is we live in a culture that embraces the things that we are being taught are not right. Just as the Romans were. The Church of Rome struggled with this on a daily basis. Because as I've said in the past, sexual immorality was a day-to-day practice in Rome. You had your temple prostitutes. It really just seemed like you couldn't walk a couple steps without someone being like, hey, let's do something sexually immoral. It's like, what? Hey, what's up? It just seemed like it was that ingrained in the society. But brothers and sisters, how is it any different today? I've gone through these numbers before. Sexual sins are not something that Korea is not, Korea is not participating in. If anything, Korea is one of the worst places when it comes to sexual sins. Right? There's that statistic. 1 out of every 5 Korean men in their 20s pays for sex at least 4 times a month, which is basically once a week, right? 20% of the male population in their 20s. This is probably the guys that are in the army or just gotten out of the army, whatever. But that's a ridiculous figure. And that's once a week. If you lower the number to once a month, I'm sure it's 40, 50%, whatever it might be. Brothers and sisters, the number's that high, it's in the church. And these are the things that no one talks about in Korea. Everyone knows that it's part of business practices to go to room salons and to take your clients out and stuff like that. No one talks about this, even at the church. But that's accepted in today's society. It's kind of crazy. When I was doing ministry in Incheon, I never found out all the details about this, but apparently there were 2 people that came to our service, met for the first time at our service, after service went, had sex, and then they had to have an abortion. And I was like, really? This is someone who came to our church? Came, they listened to a message, had a good time, and then they went and fornicated. It's like, really? Like, this is reality. This happened a couple years ago in a ministry I was in. I have friends that work at different universities, especially Sukden. All my Sukden professors are like, these girls are crazy. They tell me these stories of what they do on the weekend. They just go out to Busan, they sleep around with everybody, they come back, they tell me all the stories. And I'm like, whoa. And these are people from America. And the thing is, I think Koreans have this concept that America is like, you watch like American Pie or something stupid like that, these stupid the comedies where like it seems like everybody's sleeping around. Koreans think that's the norm in America. And so they're like, okay, I must live my college life, I must fornicate with everybody. Where in reality in America, it's not great, but that's not a daily occurrence at all. So it's like Korea has taken what they thought to be normal and amped it up at a whole nother level. And so what I'm hearing is that things are out of control. That's why Korea has become, in many people's opinions, the #1 abortion country in the world. Right? And this is a country where abortion is illegal. But everyone knows that you can just go to a place and they'll take care of it. So they don't have real figures because it's technically illegal, but they estimated like a few years ago they thought it was like 1.3 million abortions, something like that. And this is a country that's dealing with infertility, right? Where the country is actually shrinking in population because we're not making enough babies. And yet we're aborting among the top in the world. This is a reality of the country that we live in today. It's not any different than Rome. And what Paul is telling the Roman church is God has made himself clear to everyone. God has made himself clear to everyone. And everyone is rejecting him, and everyone is instead living the sinful life that they desire. So a lot of people ask me this question. Is it fair? Right? They're like, you're a Christian, and you say about how you're going to heaven and whatnot. Like, how is it fair that you're going and I'm not? Well, if you go to the logic of Paul, which is why he starts off this way, basically, all have denied God and all have sinned. What is fair in that situation? All should die. So if you're telling me fair, okay, then we all go to hell. That's what is fair, right? The assumption on why people think fairness is everyone going to heaven is because they still believe that lie that everyone is naturally good and inherently good inside. It's something that society has been telling us again and again and again, but it's not true, right? I realized this as a kid. As a kid, and as I was doing like bad things, I realized in my mind I was making a choice to do something bad. I liked it. I told some of these stories before. Like I remember I was a kid. I was maybe like not even like in kindergarten yet. I was probably like a little toddler, and I saw a bowl on the top shelf. And for some reason, I thought I could climb up on the other shelves to get the bowl, and I ended up like tearing everything out and I broke the bowl, right? I remember this as a kid, and I remember knowing that I was doing something wrong, I just did it. It's like, granted I don't have kids, but the thing is, when you confront a kid about something they've done wrong, you're never in a situation where they're like, what? I didn't do anything wrong. They immediately start crying. Because they automatically know that they had done something wrong. Maybe it's just me. Maybe kids just cry around me. I don't know. It's like kids just they know when they're doing something wrong. It's a choice. I remember in elementary school, I was we had just learned curse words, right? It's a big deal. I was going to a Christian private school, so obviously we weren't supposed to know curse words. We had just learned curse words, these 4-letter words, and we thought it would be funny if we wrote it down on a piece of paper and we buried it under the playground, and hopefully like some first and second graders would find it and start like saying it out loud and get in trouble. This was the process that we came up with, me and like 2 or 3 of my friends. It's like a conspiracy. We conspired to do this for the dismay of these little kids. growing up, or like, when South Park came out, I saw it. I knew it was over the top, but it's funny because it's true. When the movie came out, like the South Park movie is a terrible movie. Actually, kind of funny though. But one critic called it the best social commentary ever made. There's truth to the things that they poke fun at. And one of the things that they poke fun at that people were really upset at was they were showing kids to be evil. And honestly, from my childhood, that's what I realized. I wasn't a good kid. I was making these choices. So brothers and sisters, when someone asks you what is fair is for no one to go to heaven. Thank God that he's not fair. Thank God for grace and mercy that anyone can be restored in their relationship with him and can go to heaven. That is why the good news is good. If you think that you're good and that you deserve to go to heaven already, then you hear the story of Christ and say, oh, what a bummer. But I'm okay because I should go to heaven anyway. You don't need Jesus if you think you're good already. And you think you've lived a life worthy of going to heaven. But when you realize what sin is, and how our nature is to be sinful and to reject God and to embrace these other things, so much so that you can't do this on your own, you can't be saved on your own, then the gospel becomes good news to you. So the starting point for Paul's argument is that everyone is guilty. Everyone knows that God exists. Everyone fails to acknowledge him. Everyone sins against him. But we have good news, that we're not left in this situation. And brothers and sisters, what this also means is that there's work to be done. Because think about it. God is saying, everyone knows that I should exist, but the only way to embrace God is to know Jesus. Everyone can say that there's probably a creator, but not everyone can say they know who Jesus is. Someone has to go and tell them. Later on we get into Romans 10 and it talks about how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. Once we understand the reality that everyone is under, we included before we receive Jesus as our Lord and Savior, then there's a burden on us. Thank God that he is merciful and graceful. Thank God that I have a relationship with him. But you know what? There's others that don't know who he is. I have a responsibility now to share that. I have a responsibility to make sure that I'm not the only one who receives grace and mercy. So brothers and sisters, let's know reality, know the society that we live in. But let's thank God for the good news. Let's thank God for his grace. And choose to spread and share it with those that we know. Let's take some time to pray. Just want you guys to take a moment to reflect on the truth of the gospel. I just want you to take a moment to be thankful and just reflect on who you are or who you were and where God has pulled you from that place. So I want you to take a moment of thanks and recognizing how God has rescued you thus far. Let's pray.
we'd recognize how good this good news is. That we would be quick to share it with those that are around us. That we would recognize that there is work ahead of us, that others would know Jesus, and that others too could experience salvation, grace, and mercy. Let's pray. We stand before you not for anything that we've done or are doing or will do, but because of what Jesus has done for us. That though we rejected you, though we sinned and continue to sin, we are reconciled with you because of what Jesus did on the cross. Help us to understand this truth. Help us to understand the world that we live in today. And Lord, help us to embrace the obligation that we now have to share this good news with others. That others too would receive salvation. That others too would be reconciled with you. And would experience radical transformation in their